So perhaps we could begin with just a brief discussion, doesn't have to be brief, about depression and perhaps what people underestimate, don't appreciate about depression, what you have come to realize perhaps as a clinician over many decades, just to set the table, as it were, for our discussion of different treatments, comparisons, ketamine, etc.
I think that people think that depression is like having a bad day. And everybody's had a bad day. And everybody's had a few bad days. And I think that some of the confusion about depression has to do with the way in which we throw depression around as a term, like, I spilled my coffee and I'm depressed about that. Now, yeah, that is a disappointment, right? But that kind of experience isn't what we're talking about when we talk about depression. When we talk about depression is more about the experience that you're talking about. The way that depression can be a pervasive mode of being that invades every aspect of one's life and experience of the world. It affects the pattern of your thinking. In other words, instead of seeing the world as a mixture of risk and opportunity, you see the negative in everything that you engage. It affects the way you make judgments. Instead of being able to make judgments based on reasonable risk-reward kinds of decisions, everything's colored by the negativity. What people often don't appreciate about depression is that it goes beyond sadness. For many people, it can be a complete blunting of emotional experience, and people describe sometimes the loss of feeling. One of the people that we treated with ketamine said that she was just amazed to have feelings again after her depression began to lift. People often describe feeling blue when they're depressed because the contrasts in the world, their visual experience of the world is as if the normal contrasts are blunted and colors seem duller and things that are exciting and rewarding seem blander, and a kind of sapping of life's essence. This kind of depression is associated with a loss of energy, a loss of concentration, difficulty sleeping, waking up early in the morning, tossing and turning, in difficulty relaxing and feeling comfortable, being overcome with pervasive, intrusive, recurring thoughts on negative things like, I'm a terrible person, I let people down, over and over and over, ruminating on these negative, horrible ideas. And I mentioned a sapping of energy, loss of appetite, decreased interest in activities, a kind of withdrawal. This state was deemed by the Greek Hippocratic doctors as a kind of fundamental negative mode of being that they thought was connected to black bile, which in Greek had the name melon for black, cholia for bile, and then has been known as melancholia or black melancholic depression ever since. And there's another kind of depression that we also see, which is people who have the capacity to see good and bad, but who cannot constrain the way in which they react. So something good happens, they can react in a normal way to it, but something bad happens to them and they spiral downward in a very negative way, out of beyond their control, to despair and hopelessness and extreme distress. That is not the typical profile of traditional melancholic depression, but is a kind of reactive depression. So that one of the things that we appreciate about depression is that can be a very heterogeneous things. that there's a whole array of different kinds of depression. And we're just at the early stages of sorting that out. But one thing that's really important for people to understand that they often don't understand is the medical part of depression. And when I say medical part, is that we understand, yes, medical depression is a state of emotional experience. And yes, it's an altered way of brain function, but it's a brain function of an embodied brain. In other words, depression is a state that affects your entire body. Medical factors like inflammatory processes in the body related to obesity, cardiac disease, arthritis, asthma, a variety of things that cause inflammation in the body increase your risk for depression. And if you have depression, it makes inflammation worse. And that means it makes all of those medical illnesses where inflammation is a process worse. And so that if you have untreated depression, on average, it shortens your life, not by suicide. It still shortens your life by about 5 years. And if you have depression in the context of medical illnesses, it makes the medical outcomes worse. Not only the psychological outcomes, but the medical outcomes worse. So depression is a disorder of the spirit, if you will, the brain, but also the whole body. And that's one of the reasons why, number one, it's one of the most disabling conditions that we have in the world. And two, it's from a medical point of view, it's also urgently important that people are treating their depression.